thanks in advance for the contribution that you're going to make. And I really hope you enjoy the engagement with the students, albeit through an online platform this year. And to the students, an invitation. Joshua will. Jo- Sorry, I'm hearing myself. Joshua will invite you to ask questions and so on. So please just don't sit back and listen for an hour. The man has got a wealth of experience and knowledge as far as it relates to this subject matter. So please get the most out of the session this afternoon. Joshua, over to you. Thanks. Marie, and you are recording, yes?
Yes, I am.
Thanks, Dion, and thanks for Peter Marie for the opportunity. Maybe I can just ask, a sound check if everybody is online. I'm sure Marie, you're going to keep us honest in terms of questions, and you guys are more than welcome to ask questions. It's a little bit difficult on this platform to see everybody's hands. As I said, I'm going to stay on presentation mode. My face is not much to look at, so the voice is the important side. So Dion, thank you very much. With the introduction, it might be a little bit confusing. Qualifications in medical physics, and I'm a sustainable development manager at a mine. You can clearly see that I have not sorted out my career path yet. So therefore, the disclaimer at the bottom of the presentation, really today is just about sharing. There's no guarantees for this training. It is informal and for educational purposes only. So let's just make that clear. If you don't pass, talk to Dion, not to me. If I can start, under normal circumstances, we would have done a round of introductions. But I assume that everybody on this course is keen and interested in project management, either as part of your responsibility or your own development. And I think some of the things that I'll mention initially, you've probably done this in a lot more detail than what I can cover in this short presentation. But just to get to the couple of the definitions, just to maybe refresh our memories, project management is really about planning and execution and controlling. Amongst others, our stakeholders. And if you look at the definition of a stakeholder, it is a critical component of the successful delivery of any project. And I think many project managers and those of you that have been involved in any form of project management will agree with me that the things that you manage are the easy ones. The people that you manage are the difficult ones. And this is typically what we find with stakeholders. Stakeholders many a time are either the success or the failure of projects, and that's an important aspect to realize right from the start, and therefore the focus on stakeholder management. If I can carry along the lines of project management, the theory of project management, whether you do it the PMBOK training. I'm getting a little bit of feedback, guys. If you can maybe just mute unless you have a particular question, I would appreciate that. All right, so the initiation, the planning, the exercising, all of the aspects that you learn in your project management theory. But I want to highlight one sentence in terms of these definitions, is that the objectives of your project must be clearly established, and they could impact on decisions made by other people involved in the project. Project managers, designers, contractors, subcontractors, your external stakeholders. You can have the best plan in the world. You can have the best technology in the world. You can have the best resources in the world. If you're not able to control the various people within your project, this is where the problems start. If you look at some of the complexity of most of our projects, typically that you would find, and you guys go into this as through a lot more depth. Whether it's the purpose of your project, the goals that you've established for yourselves, the deliverables. There's a whole suite of tasks that has to be performed. There's project schedules. There's procurement processes that are involved. You have a budget that you have to comply with, your resources, your material resources, the risks associated with this, your client on the receiving side of things, the governance associated with projects. Typically in the mining industry, we have stacks of governance aspects that we have to comply with. And similarly in terms of the quality of your final product. So already without making stakeholder engagement too complex, there's a lot of things that are associated with normal project management. And the stakeholder management is really the glue that keeps all of these pieces together, because for each of those blocks, there's some form of communication that needs to happen with one of your stakeholders or more than one of your stakeholders. And it's not something that should be underestimated. If you're a full-time project manager, like hopefully many of you are, and not a part-time project management like I am, then it would be good to think about some of the characteristics of a good project management. The ability to anticipate needs, anticipate problems. You must have a plan. You must be driven, not complain, be able to delegate the tasks within your project, inspire people and focus on solutions, and foster good relations. And that is absolutely key. Now, under normal circumstances, for this presentation, we would break into two groups, and I'm just going to tell you the story around this picture, and maybe you can associate with that. Now, what we typically do in the classroom is I construct with little Lego blocks a structure. Now, I'm not even myself is 100% sure what was built there. And then what I do is I give the same blocks to two groups of people, and I ask one person to be nominated from each group to just come and have a look at the final product that they have to construct. They have 1 minute to view it, and then they must communicate this to the rest of the group. Now, this is typically what happens in many of our projects that we do. There's maybe one person, maybe it's the customer, maybe it's the manager, maybe it is somebody externally that knows very well what they think they know very well what they want, and that gets then either showed to the project manager or communicated through an email or through a very complicated business document. But to translate that understanding to the rest of the team sometimes is fun, as we normally see with this exercise. You know, in the first round of communication, the ability to communicate something as abstract as this to a team of people is quite difficult, and it is quite fun to see the interaction in the teams, and as the team communicate and start to stabilize in terms of their communication and start to share plans on how to find out how to construct this thing, up to the point where somebody just takes a smartphone and takes a photo of it and construct it. Those dynamics are the typical dynamics that you find in most projects, especially where you've got multidisciplinary teams where one department or one individual knows exactly what he wants to do, but the rest of the people that are involved doesn't really have the understanding or the context of the project, and it's a pity we can't do this in person. I thought about some clever ideas on how to do this in this platform, but I'm afraid that's not quite going to work out. So some of the important lessons that you learn from project management, the projects that failed, I've included a couple of links here, which is difficult to share over the screen, but the last point is really what I want to focus on. Stakeholder engagement must be focused and planned. You can study all the aspects of project management to the nth degree. Know everything about PMBOK, know everything about project scheduling, have very complicated Excel models in terms of procurement. But if your stakeholder engagement fails, your project is definitely going to fail. I just want to do a quick check-in. Can somebody just maybe say something on this line?
Joshua, you're loud and clear and of a good quality. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Dion.
There is life on the other side.
No, it's extremely
least, yeah.
quiet. It is quite eerie to. Is this the COVID silence that we talk about? Anyway, thank you, Dion.
Okay.
To continue really to the crux of what I want to share with you guys today, the stakeholder management part of it. And if you, as you can see from this picture, you know, sometimes you do require stakeholder input before you even start with a project to find out whether it's a good idea or not. If you look at typical stakeholder mistakes, and this is lessons that I think many people have learned and that I've learned myself as well. Some of the mistakes we make with stakeholders, we totally underestimate the identification and prioritization of our stakeholders. In the working environment that I'm in, typically you get bundled into a project or you get asked to do a specific project without fully appreciating the extent and the number of stakeholders and also which of the stakeholders are critical. So we'll go a little bit deeper into that aspect, but it's one of the key failures is not identifying your stakeholders. We tend as project managers or as engineers or technical people to rush into the workings of the project and leave the softer science and the people's aspects behind. And I can tell you from personal experience, this has backfired on many projects, and I've made the same mistake. So before the project starts, take your time. Take your time to evaluate the number of stakeholders that you have internally, the amount of stakeholders you have externally, those people that they call interested parties that you tend to dismiss right at the beginning of a project. Make 100% sure that there is not any way that they could influence the outcome of your project. One thing that all project managers do is we tend to overpromise and underdeliver. And depending on the work situation that you're in, whether you're a project manager within an organization or whether you're a project manager working for a projects company, inevitably that unfortunately makes you lose credibility. It makes you lose credibility in terms of project delivery, but it also makes you lose credibility with your stakeholders internally. Because if you fail to meet your timelines or your deliverables to any of the stakeholders, that erodes your own credibility and it makes the next engagement just so much more difficult. So applying your mind in terms of planning the project, building in the stakeholder engagement aspects into your project planning. I've seen it many times where we you know, there's this fixed schedule. We will have a weekly meeting and we will have a monthly meeting or a quarterly meeting or a project meeting once in a blue moon. You'll be surprised how much time the stakeholder engagement actually takes from your project, especially if you don't plan for it. Just inviting the stakeholders to a meeting and sharing information is not necessarily the answer. It needs to be focused, and that must be built into your project plan. The last one, the actual communication plan, is how you will communicate with stakeholders. It's no use that you identify all your stakeholders, you prioritize them, and you have realistic expectations, but you don't have a plan in terms of how you're going to provide feedback. I do a lot of work in the mining industry within communities, with municipalities, and the example that I use later, I'll go into a little bit more detail. But the method of communication, the way you're going to communicate, there's nothing more frustrating for an external stakeholder, you know, just receiving an email or a note or something. You have to make time for the personal communication and the contact, so that you can test understanding, that you can create context to the communication. That is absolutely important, and you need to apply your mind up front as to how your communication plan is going to look like. Okay. If I can carry on, the influence of stakeholders on the project can be huge if not managed appropriately. As I mentioned before, you know, the lack of stakeholder engagement or ineffective stakeholder engagement can extend delays. It can drain your resources because instead of doing work, people are running around chasing after people instead of chasing after work. and could lead to unnecessary or untimely project termination in certain cases, in extreme cases, where the customers are external to your organization, or like in my case, where many of the projects we do for our local municipalities and for government for compliance purposes, you could have a project terminated not because of the content or the product that you want to deliver, but because of lack of engagement and proper mandating through whatever structures you have in place. All right. So as I mentioned before, and I'm gonna share these slides with you on the team so you can read this in your own time. But the stakeholder identification is absolutely critical, as I mentioned before. Understanding the needs of your stakeholders. And in the practical example, I will elaborate a little bit further. But a very simple project with a very simple deliverable is perceived completely differently by the different stakeholders. If I can take an example in our world, a lot of the work that we do in compliance of a legislation or a regulatory requirement that we have in various acts or regulations. So for the government, for example, their need is the compliance part. The communities and the municipalities for which we do some of the work that we do, for them it's something completely different. Whether we construct a road or a hospital or a clinic or a training facility, that is their need. Whereas a member of the community, for him at the end of the day, that project that we deliver is a job. It's bread and butter. It brings food to his table. For you as a project manager, you know, maybe you're looking at your next increase or your next promotion. So your underlying need for the same deliverable is different. And if project managers apply their minds and really understand that when you engage with an external party, understand what their need is in the context of that project. This is not just in, like manufacturing or systems development projects where, a person asks you to develop a particular piece of software. You know full well that you have to guide your customer as well. You need to check their understanding and what is important, which part of that product that you're going to deliver is important to them. And the same in project management. Managing expectations. I'll show you guys a little picture later, but understand and shape your stakeholders' expectations. Sometimes many of our stakeholders do not fully understand even what they want. Especially in a very complex project, and they might have completely different expectations than what you have in the project itself. And then lastly, communication. Seeking to understand what preferences, just in terms of the type of communication that you use, the way you communicate, is absolutely critical. Okay, if I can delve a little bit deeper into each of those aspects, your stakeholder engagement and ranking, and I know, even myself, who's been in project management for a while, we tend to skip this part because it takes effort and it looks difficult, and you need to find a way that suits your project and suits your organization in terms of how to identify. What many large companies have is extensive stakeholder lists or lists of internal and external stakeholders that you can typically select from. That can be quite useful if you do a project from the start. It really is just about sitting down, applying your mind, and first of all, just list the core team of people that are sitting in your project. List the organizations, either internally or externally, that are involved, whether there's a design engineer or a systems administrator or even a help desk agent of some sorts that is there. Make sure you have them on the list and make sure you understand what impact is, and then you make the net even wider until you get to your external boundaries. Typically your regulatory framework, your regulatory institutions, your financial institutions, many of the projects, banks are involved, boards of directors are involved, There's some other political groupings that might be involved. So once you have your list, then you can proceed. And from the start, understanding that each of these stakeholders have a different need. I think the picture on the left-hand side is quite descriptive in terms of a project. You know, where the puzzle is the project that you want to complete, and each of the stakeholders have got a piece of that puzzle. And your role as project manager, as far as stakeholder engagement, is to ensure that every person understand what their puzzle is, what their contribution is, and what they can contribute to the project, and finding the best way of doing that. Now, if you're really diligent, you know, you might come up with a list of 100 stakeholders. Now, it's completely impossible to manage 100 stakeholders to the same level of intensity. So that's why they talk about risk ranking of your stakeholders. So apply your mind for each of those stakeholders. You can use a very simple model as indicated there to say what is the power or the influence that they have over your project. You know, your company's CEO might have 100% power in terms of the project that you're busy with, but he might not even know that you're doing the project. And if you're not communicating, maybe he just needs to be informed. Maybe you need to keep to your company policies. You know, there's a sanction that is required for that particular project. But that person is so important that you have to keep that individual or that group satisfied in terms of the project. If you look at some of the guys that make the most noise, guys with high interest, and this is typically what you see from, and I apologize in advance if this sounds maybe insensitive, but what you find with many of your NGOs and external groupies, people make a lot of noise, but they don't necessarily have the power in the project to turn that project around. You need to keep people informed. People will react based on their perception. So if you do a project within the community, make sure that the community is informed, because informed people can make sensible decisions. Otherwise, they will have an opinion. If they have not been informed, they react completely different. And then in the top right-hand corner, those are the critical people on your list. Those are the ones that you have to manage closely, that you have to pamper, that you have to provide information to, and that you have to keep very close to yourself. And once you have this, then it's much easier to manage a multitude of stakeholders. Once you've ranked them, and their ranking might change. You know, as the project proceeds, you might find or realize that you've kind of underestimated the risk associated with one particular stakeholder, and it gives you the ability then to move that person either to a high power, high interest, or low power, low interest block as you proceed. Now, this is probably the simplest way. It's just to have a list, have a high, medium, low ranking for each of your stakeholders, keeping it relatively simple. Some projects will require that you go even further than that. You might choose, if you have the capacity within the organization, to really do a comprehensive assessment of each of those stakeholders. We look at responsibility, accountability, whether they're only there for support, whether they just need to be consulted or just need to be informed. And you can get very, very complicated with many of these lists. But that depends on the scope of your project. This depends on the complexity of your project. In most cases, what I find, being a poor project manager myself, my own admission, is keep it simple. You know, keep things relatively simple, with a basic high, medium, low ranking of your stakeholders. Okay. All right. If I can carry on.
Joshua.
Yes.
Dion, yeah, if I might come in, and for the group's interest as well, I think if you go to that slide, I think the important thing here to notice is that through every different phase of a specific project's execution, but very importantly also through the life cycle of a project, that the stakeholders will keep on changing, And also the same stakeholders will keep on changing their point of view. And
Absolutely.
this is why keeping track of your stakeholder management and the plan related to it is so important right through the project. It's a living exercise. It's not something you do up front and then you say you've done it and you've drafted your communication plan and it's solved from there. But
Yeah.
but every phase of the project, as you progress, as you proceed, that environment is constantly changing as well, and you have to stay abreast of that. Do you have like a classical example or a story that would explain something like that? Thank you.
Dion, I think if we we'll get to the example, just now, but you know, through the different phases of projects, and I'll maybe give you one example. The typical way a company is structured. I mean, I mentioned the CEO. You know, you've got your board of directors, you've got your executive management, and then your respective heads of disciplines. Let me take a financial director, for example, who was one of your key stakeholders. There's 2 or 3 times during the project, maybe in the initial phase of the project, in terms of requesting, you know, the project to proceed. You will have that engagement, and you follow certain policies, and then he basically will exit your project. Where you do need to keep a person, he changes from being a critical part of the decision making. He gives you the authority to execute the project, approves the project finances. During the project, he becomes an informed person. In other words, you just keep him up to date in terms of expenditure. There's no real interface or interaction. Every time there's a change in the scope of your project, or there's a change in timeline, or you see maybe that you're going to exceed your budget, that person's importance change. It changes, as Dion has rightly said. You know, the same person, the same structure, but all of a sudden he becomes a critical stakeholder. And you know, a practical example, that's not the type of person you just drop an email to and say, listen, by the way, I need a 10% contingency on a project. There you have to go back, re-engage, re-establish the engagement, again explain context of the project, and move forward. And in many cases, if you don't keep tabs, I mean, I referred earlier to communities, and I'll expand a little bit in the example as well. You could very easily initially dismiss or discard that. But if you don't keep tabs on what is happening in your community, there might be external or other forces that will influence your project, and your project can very easily be overrun if you don't keep in contact with that particular stakeholder grouping. And it might not be critical in terms of execution, but could very easily disrupt your project if you don't maintain that. All right, I'm gonna just quickly skip on. The first things is in terms of project expectations. I hope you guys can see on the screen there. But this is typically what happens in a project. You know, a customer or the person who wants the project delivered will explain something. The guy who takes the notes in the project meeting, or the project manager, he has his interpretation of what the customer wants. Typically, what you promise the customer is much more that is there. You give it to your design engineers. They design the most practical solution. What the customer is built for, I mean, I think that's tongue in the cheek. And at the end of the day, you sit with an unhappy customer. And the only reason why you find yourself in this situation is at that very first step is to check and verify. Check and verify that is the mutual understanding with all of your stakeholders. I mean, you can imagine, and this is typically what happens sometimes when you do projects that affect external stakeholders. If people have such a varied interpretation of or expectation of a particular project, at the end of the day, you're going to have a whole group of people that are dissatisfied and disgruntled about the project that is delivered. I just want to give you one example, and you guys are welcome to go and read some of these papers that have been published. The extractive sector of the mining industry, of which I'm part of. There's just a couple of bullet points to indicate the significant impact that local communities have on mining, and not just a direct impact in terms of disruption of business, etc. We for the bulk of the mining projects that we do, we require authorization from some other government. Whether we operate in this country or whether we operate abroad, and in that process, you also need to have the approval from local communities through whichever structure there is. If you look at the numbers at the bottom, one of the big capital expenditure projects between 3 and 5 billion rand, they estimate suffer around $20 million a week of delayed production. So if you construct a new mine out in Africa, or even in our own country, or whether you just want to extend or expand, if you look at the NPV of a multi-billion rand project, for every week that you are delayed because of either community uprising or community resistance or stakeholders that are delaying decision-making processes from regulators, you tend to spend a very, very large amount of money. Now, that number is very difficult to quantify and to assess. And this is why projects typically overrun in terms of cost. You see the delays of the project, you see the disruption of the project, but nobody actually has an entry on your books to say, this is actually your poor stakeholder relationship that has caused this. And I think there are many CEOs and many companies across the globe that realize that and are really trying to put an effort into ensuring that stakeholders have an input. If I look at what is typically happening in the current situation in this country, as far as interested parties and stakeholders having direct access to things like social media, I don't know how many smokers we have on the on this presentation, but I say this tongue in cheek. If you look at the communication and how quickly sentiment changes towards government trying to do what they're currently doing in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, that gives you some sense of how powerful communities, how powerful your external stakeholders can be if you underestimate the sentiment towards your project. And that could very easily either ruin a project or delay it to such an extent that it's just not economically feasible any further to execute. So the costs associated with poor stakeholder engagement are very rarely quantified in terms of an actual number, but you see it on the bottom line of the project. You see it indirectly, as I said, as a result of over expenditure or delays in the project, or having to redo designs 4, 5, 6 times because of a lack of stakeholder engagement up front. If you really want to go and study in depth in terms of how important stakeholder engagement and good practices around stakeholder engagement is, there are excellent guidelines out there. I wouldn't necessarily promote this to somebody who's doing a relatively small project and just wants to carry on. But the more you read around these issues, the more the understanding about why it is important to look at things like stakeholder consultation, how to negotiate, what the management functions are around these things. Absolutely critically important, and these are international guidelines, and I think there are many similar ones. So my advice to everyone on this, on this call would be go and read as much as you can around these aspects, learn from the experiences that are shared across the world, and take it from there. Okay, I'm gonna dive directly into a practical example. And this is a personal project, and as I said in the beginning, remember the disclaimer. So please don't hold any of this against me. I work for our Sustainable Development Department within the company that I'm currently working for. And we are sitting in a regulated environment. So theoretically, projects associated with social development or socioeconomic development should be relatively easy to implement. We made an agreement with one of our local municipalities as far as our social and labor plans are concerned, that we would resurface and reconstruct some of the municipal roads over the next 5 years, and we've committed 60 million rand approximately to be spent over the 5 years. So as far as the project is concerned, it should be relatively straightforward. We've got an act, the Mineral Petroleum Development Resource Development Act, that dictates on how we must do things. We have an approved social and labor plan. We've got mine community development projects that we've got a dedicated team of people to do, and we have the finances to do that. So straightforward. Mining rights are in place. We've identified the roads that we need to do. The technology is available. Local contractors are available. We know what the end product is going to be like. So it should theoretically be very, very straightforward. In terms of the technical specifications of the project, we've got our contractors. In terms of contract selection, the right technical selection of contractors can be made. We've got a very simple project management structure with a steering committee that supports me as a project manager. We've got engagement with the municipality, who's our main client. We've appointed a qualified consulting engineer. There's a local road contractor, and this project through the SLP should benefit the community at the end of the day. So straightforward. We decided to follow our own company's financial and procurement processes. So there are fixed policies in place. Again, straightforward. Those of you that have now really grown accustomed to project management, there's your project schedule. So therefore we can do the work breakdown structure, and we can continue with the project. So very simple to do. However, and this is the experiences that I'd like to share with you guys. Despite having all the legislation in place, having approved plans as far as our SLPs are concerned, there's a reality in terms of our environment in which we operate. Okay, as I said, very simple. Qualified engineer to construct roads over the next 5 years. Roads have been identified, no problem. As far as our stakeholders are concerned, we find ourselves working in an environment where our main customer is a municipality, and the comments I make now really is just a reality check. There are challenges around service delivery in the country, around local and district municipalities in general. We have a lot of residents in our communities that are disgruntled around service delivery. So the environment in which we're going to deliver this project, we completely underestimate. The expectation from the community where we're going to construct the road is actually not the road. It is the jobs that the road construction will create. As I said in the beginning, same project, same deliverable, different expectations. Our ability to execute the project in that environment and the financial constraints associated with the municipality itself, the ability for them to contribute to this project, is very, very, very difficult. The community itself sits in poverty, very high expectations, lack of skills. Every project that comes along, whether you are constructing a high-rise building or whether you want to do a very basic job, the expectations in the community remain the same. If you don't have a job and you don't have an ability to feed your family, the expectations from the project is exactly the same, regardless of what the technical capacity should be for this. A lot of focus on women and youth as far as road construction is concerned.
those are the community expectations. That's what they would like to see. Then we're sitting with organized business, also with very high expectations, varied skills. I say they're wheeling and dealing. As in most industries, there's always competition amongst businesses, and that is the environment in which you want to land this very simple project. So they, just in terms of the stakeholders identified in that group, you can already see the complexity associated with this project. If we look at the legal and the company structures, even there, you find challenges as far as stakeholders are concerned. As a mining industry, we have very rigid systems. We have very rigid policies and procedures that are designed specifically for mining, and not necessarily for socio-economic development projects. We decided to do the project in line with our own policies and our own systems to ensure that that the project is done above board, and that we don't just transfer money. We actually want to deliver the projects ourselves, and therefore now all of a sudden you find yourself with a very rigid system, a very rigid policy, very rigid requirements in terms of how to get vendors registered. But you go out into a community where you've got semi-skilled or maybe not adequately skilled people, and you want to bring them onto a system which is designed by the mine for mining. Okay, so you can see there you're nearly your own worst enemy, and that internally requires extensive stakeholder engagements with your procurement managers, with your vendor registrations, so that people can understand what the type of project is that you want to do. In terms of what we had out there, multiple stakeholders, as I said before, the regulatory part of it was not negotiable. What the Department of Mineral Resources, for example, want to see is they want to see me spend 60 million rand over 5 years. That's it. That's how I get measured by that department. They want to see issues of ownership. They want to see that we use local content, and each of those aspects poses a serious challenge as far as engagements are concerned, because you've got limited resources, a very focused project, but you have to satisfy all of those stakeholders. If you look at the technical side, and this is now where the engineers come in, this is actually supposed to be very simple, because usually engineers will tell you that they are able to do the job without any other intervention, and that personally is why I love engineers, because they make sure that they keep me in the job. As far as failures are concerned, because every time an engineer fails, I can clean up the environment, or I can go and fix it. And it's because of this reason that focusing purely on the technical things, even that poses challenges. Not having all the skills that we were supposed to have, within the businesses in that particular area, posed some very, very challenging times for the quality control associated with this, with on-site supervision. As we went from one phase to the next, the responsibilities that we initially put on the consulting engineer was the design and quality control. That was their only job. And very soon did we realize, because the skill sets are not necessarily there within the areas where we operate, with the second and third phases of this particular project, just as an example, we increased the scope of the consulting engineer's responsibility to also include a portion of development and SMME development, to be able to hold these guys' hands. So instead of having conflict between the technical consulting engineers and the contractors that we get from the community, rather than beat the guys up when they're not performing, we built in a dedicated contract element in the tender, which said SMME development or contract mentorship, and that completely changed the attitude. It changed the attitude on both sides. Instead of having the conflict, And similarly with with the municipality. With the municipality, we're sitting with a very difficult situation. You deal with the executive mayor, you deal with a municipal manager, you get approval, but not understanding how municipal structures work. You have the political leaders and you have the officials appointed by the municipality. And if you don't understand that, and you get mixed messages from those structures, you could very easily find yourself that projects are not allowed to continue by a local councillor. Doesn't matter whether the executive mayor said you can continue. You've not taken your local councillor along. You've underestimated his influence in the area. And if you really don't manage it, you can find yourself that it escalates into into a local uprising, or you get the community on site saying, listen, you must stop the contract. So what started off as a very simple, straightforward project has really been complicated by the various stakeholders and the extent of the stakeholder issues. In the first phase of the project, we had business forums in that region who decided, listen, they're going to talk to the municipality about getting a share in the project. That didn't work. They came to us as a company. They challenged the sustainable development team and said, listen, the projects are not designed despite it already having been approved. Then they tried the legal route, and eventually they started intimidating the technical guys on site. And it goes back to what I started off with: not identifying and not appreciating the risk associated with those stakeholders. Initially, our view on the business forums was, it's fine, none of our business. We deal directly with the municipality who has a link to the community. But we very soon realized that you have to take those guys along. Not necessarily their permission. And this is something that I think a project manager should also guard against when he's responsible for stakeholder management. You cannot please everyone, but you can definitely do better at ensuring that there's mutual understanding, even if you agree to disagree, that you don't have unnecessary upsets in your project. Okay. So I use this example just to give you some flavor of the multitude of stakeholders that you could have in a very simple project and how these could influence each other. If you underestimate any one of them, they can really come back and bite you. We've had, if you look at this picture in this last couple of months, you put COVID-19 on top of this and the delays in terms of the sequence of how to get people back at work. The hunger that is out there in terms of doing the projects is absolutely unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable.
Joshua, I don't know if I should let you finish, but I really want to ask you something.
Please do. Yeah, sorry guys.
I tell you why. With this whole hijacking of the country.
Yeah.
I know SAP was involved, Gartner was involved, KPMG was involved, Deloitte was involved, but I know a lot of the fairly senior guys in those areas, and I spoke to the head of consulting from Gartner, and he's saying it is so, you got to be so careful, because they dealt 100% according to governance as they were instructed by government from their perspective, right? Not knowing what the role of a Gupta or whoever else were playing. These guys are all now made out to be like they didn't run according to governance, right? So they are not fair traders or whatever. And in the meantime, they were following almost more than the blueprint that was given to them. So I think if you can maybe share with us, because I know you got to be so careful in your kind of environment as well, because you could be told in this community you have to deal with that person. And you don't know is that a community support thing? Is that a political enhancement thing, or what it is? So I don't know if you. I know it might be a weird question, but I think the guys that came out to look like they were implicated, but they definitely didn't go in there knowing that they were going to do something wrong.
Yeah. No, I think what I can say to you guys up front, and if I go back a couple of years, even before we started with these projects, we agreed as a company that we would bring these projects closer to us, closer to our own governance processes. That we are not dictated by governance processes external to the company. You know, so we had very clear stage gates in terms of these processes. There's a mutual agreement, and it's public record, and there's multiple regulators that get informed around the scope of the projects that we do. You know, so that's really open for public scrutiny. So once project identification and the scope has been agreed, we internalize that and we follow our own. And that's why I say, you know, the challenges that we experience, but also to our benefit, is we follow our own company's procurement policies, vendor registrations, adjudications. I mean, as I sit here, I'm doing multiple projects, but the company is structured as such. I cannot adjudicate a contract myself. You know, there's adjudication committees, there are governance processes involved. So my advice for anybody doing business in that space is not to just depend, exactly what you're saying, and not just to depend on what is perceived as policy or protocol. You have people in executive or senior positions within many of these structures that will try and influence the project. And I mean, it is actually amazing. I have had, in the last couple of years, I had to call people to order, either individuals or groups to order, to say, listen, our procurement processes are above board. You know, it's open, it's there, it's open for scrutiny, and these are the processes that we follow. If you rely as a project manager, especially if you do external projects, on external governance processes which you do not fully understand, I think that's where people get roped. You know, unless they willingly do that, but this is where people get roped into these kinds of situations. Is to be very, very mindful and very careful about you know, investment and execution and being influenced in these processes. So yeah, I think the context in which you made your comment, I can't relate or expand too much on that.
Thanks.
But
it's very
100%.
much what you were what you're saying. I mean, it's good advice, because those stakeholders, you think they're just a stakeholder, but you got to look at deeper than that.
It's unbelievable, and you know, sometimes there's just a very real different need. What I say to you guys in the beginning, you know, there's a very real need and a very real expectation out there, especially in a country where, you know, we've got large numbers of unemployment, and unfortunately, you know, the guys with the real needs and where the real delivery should be, there are unfortunately people that take advantage of that. You know, it's actually surprising how quickly people can be mobilized for the wrong reasons and the wrong agendas. So my only advice during this process, and I'm thankful, you know, I'm thankful that I work for a company with clear policies and procedures and vendor systems where I can distance myself from, you know, from that. But as a project manager, that's something that I would ask, you know, just my advice would be just guard against that. Absolutely. You know, don't make promises, don't make commitments around any of the processes that are not properly governed, because they will come back and bite you. Okay, listen, I don't know how we're doing for time. I think we are very close to the end of the discussion. I don't know. Maybe just in conclusion, I mean, for the hard project managers out there and the engineers and the technical guys out there, I've got a bit of advice, because I also come from a scientific background rather than a soft science background. The issues that we're talking about are the issues that we typically do not want to appreciate. The soft science, whether it's the complexity or the extent of a stakeholder database, spending the time ranking your stakeholders, keeping tabs on your stakeholders, and just communicating. And I always add this, because this is a personal thing for me, is people are different and not necessarily wrong. And yeah, forgetting about politics or you know, the complexity of all the different stakeholders, people as individuals are completely different. And when you talk about stakeholder engagement, it's important to recognize as a project manager, first of all, who you actually are, how you operate, and versus how other people operate. Now, Dion can maybe comment on this. I know that somewhere in the project, you guys look at Myers-Briggs and a couple of other things. I think so. I think there is some reference to this, but it is quite a fun exercise, and I think we've run out of time. But it's something that I suggest you guys do for yourselves as well, in terms of your ability to communicate, having the emotional intelligence or the capacity to actually deal with people that are made up slightly different than you. Because as a project manager, you don't have the luxury of selecting or choosing your stakeholders. You don't have the luxury of always choosing or selecting your teams according to, you know, preference in terms of the way they work. And if you go through exercises like this, which some of you guys have done, if you very quickly, and if you guys are still got 1 minute of energy left, if I go through the following slides, if you just on a piece of paper next to you, if you quickly can associate with, you know, just write down either an E or an I, and I'll give you like 5 seconds just to scan through that and see kind of what you associate with. It should be relatively easy. You will recognize yourself in those 2 boxes, either an E or an I. And then how do you see the world that will gather information? You're either a sensor or you're intuitive. Just write down an S or an N. I'm doing this a bit rushed, so I apologize for that. And how do you make decisions? Are you a thinker or are you a feeler? Do you go with your gut or do you analyze? And does things have to make logical sense to you? Just write down a T or an F. And lastly, how do you plan? How much do you like to plan ahead? Are you organized or structured? Are you casual or relaxed? So theoretically, everybody on the call should have some indication of who they are. If you flick onto the rest of the theory behind this Myers-Briggs, you will quickly find out that every one of us are different. Your personality type really influences the way you communicate. It influences the way you gather information. It influences the way you recharge and how you execute your work. And if you recognize this as a project manager, even if it is just this, it will go a long way in terms of ensuring successful projects. Because then when you engage with individuals either perceived to be stubborn or that you struggle to engage with, you can find ways to identify and find strategies in terms of your engagement on how to communicate. So that was just a little bit of fun. I'm going to stop here. That is the last slide. So I don't know, Dion or Pietie, I don't know how you wanna do this. Are we going to have a couple of seconds for questions or?
I think so, Josh. I think that'll be great. Funny enough, you were talking about the Myers-Briggs, and that came out in our lectures this morning. We were saying it's like one of the things we're going to do this week is do Myers-Briggs and the Belbins, because we can do that. We basically have got access to doing those. So we're going to do it with this APM group. And as you say, it's fun, but it's also the value you can get out of that by doing that. And also by, even if you know you've got key stakeholders that you've got to work very close to make sure you know what they are, because then you know how to communicate, when to communicate, what format to communicate, how often, and how they're going to make the decisions. And I think that is so you know, that those are things that are so, I agree. It's like, it's insanely important to make sure you can do that.
Absolutely. 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 I see there's a hand up here. What is it, Lucy?
Yes, it's Lucy. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay. I actually have a question. It comes from also a question that was asked in the morning, in one of the sessions in the morning. You mentioned right at the beginning that we must manage. So the most important thing is to manage the stakeholders, the relationships, because that's the make or the break of the project. But I just want to find out from you, as an experienced person within the field, and I mean the mind, I'm sure it's even more, like you've said to us, it's complicated. But how do you manage these politics and powers or power struggles within projects? In the morning, a question was asked about a small business where one finds themselves being called a project manager. But in actual fact, this person is the business process manager as well. They do everything. And you find yourself in situations where you actually don't even have decision-making powers and budget controls and stuff like that. How do you manage it when you are, in essence, on paper, a project manager, but it doesn't translate to it when it comes to the actual process or the project? You find yourself either being the jack of all trades, doing everything, or you have limitations. You do certain things to an extent. How do you manage that?
I think I hear two things from from your question. The one is not necessarily having the authority or the budget or the control, or not necessarily having the resources, to be able to do those things. And I think you're right. Your comment about jack of all trades is, I think if you follow the project management principles that you're learning at the moment, you might find yourself in a project not necessarily responsible for all of those aspects. I mean, this is something that I've certainly learned. You must either work as a team, or you must be able to put your hand up and say, listen, there's certain resources that you do not have, and recognize that. If you don't control your own project's budget, surely there must be things that you need to do to be able to have access to those funds. Either present in terms of the progress with the project, or the invoicing schedules, or all of those things. So I think that also comes with experience to some extent. I like the term jack of all trades, because that really is what a good project manager should be. He must have an understanding about finance. He must have an understanding about procurement. He must have an understanding about your community engagement, or whatever context you have. And I think that comes with experience, and that's why I say when you go through project management, depending on what your base qualifications or your base understanding is, or what the purpose is that you did this course in, read, learn, talk to people, understand. And if you're working in an organization and as a project manager you're not able to do your work, that's also part of stakeholder engagement, because that will ensure that you actually engage with your executive or engage with your senior managers and say, listen, guys, you're giving me a project, you're not giving me the resources to be able to do this project. And I think that's important. A project manager doesn't have to control everything. A project manager coordinates work. If you can wrap your mind around that, you're really there to coordinate work. You don't necessarily have to have all of the accountability and all of the authority to do each and every step, because that's a danger. That is a very dangerous thing that I've learned as well. I don't like to delegate. It's one of my personal shortcomings. I don't like to delegate work, but you have to. If your project is too big, you have to delegate certain work, and you have to put the controls in place. So that's the advice I can give you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any more questions, ladies and gentlemen?
Nothing from our side. I'm fine, thanks.
I'm happy. Thank you very much, Josh.
Joshua, it must be that you provided then all the answers to all the questions that they had up front. So I just think that makes for a fantastic session that we had with you once again. And the session this year is shorter compared to previous sessions. So I really think you did an excellent job of bringing a lot of information together in one presentation. If I could quickly summarize, I think with related to your Lego exercise, I think clarity up front when we define projects is of the utmost importance. It's a foundation. I wrote down the words focused, planned when it comes to stakeholder engagements. A major thing that stood out for me is once again expectation management. Hey, and it came out so nicely in the practical example that you shared with us, the case. And then also the comment we made with regards to how the focused effort, the thinking, the identification, the rating, all these things, how they differ throughout the project lifecycle, and how we continually need to realign ourselves to our stakeholders. And there's a reason why stakeholder management features in the PMBOK as part of the feasibility of a project, because it is, like you rightly commented, the one thing that will make or break your project. Doesn't matter if everything else is in place.
No,
so
absolutely.
Yeah, so from our side, once again, just thank you very much. I believe in this day and age, we should not give you a small gift again, but a carton of cigarettes would do.
Listen, now I've been encouraged to reduce my intake of that. Fortunately, the alcohol is there, so at least I can have a cold beer.
Great, yeah, but I assume you also have your fingers in the Zama networks, so cigarettes is not a problem, I think.
I'm not going to admit anything in public.
No
so,
comments.
But
No
thank
comments.
you for your concern.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's me. And Joshua, once again, brilliant effort. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, guys.
Thanks,
guys,
Dion.
and
Thanks,
thanks for your
Joshua.
attention.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, everybody, we're going to go off. Let's go off 15 minutes, have a break, and then we all go back online on Zoom at 3:30. So all the delegates. So everybody that's in class, then we can just do a close-up, a close-off quickly at 3:30. Is that okay?
Thanks, Preet.
That's okay, Prof.
That's okay.
Yes, sir.